Amara Sterling moved through the shadows of a gilded lily like a ghost in an apron. At 24, she was just a background detail to the city's power players, a hand that refilled water, a back that cleared plates, a face no one bothered to remember. Nobody knew she spoke Greek. Growing up in the Astoria docks, she'd learned the language from the old sailors and the hard-eyed men who ran the piers. It was her secret edge, a hidden piece of herself she never used, until tonight. She had served Silas Kong exactly 4 times. Silas was 38, precise, and possessed a coldness that seemed to drop the room's temperature by 10 degrees. He was the kind of man who viewed staff as furniture. To him, Amara wasn't a person. She was a delivery system for his $2,000 scotch. Amara stood behind the heavy oak partition of the executive suite, tray in hand. Inside, Silas sat at his desk, silhouetted against the New York skyline. Behind him stood Elias and Julian, his shadows, his protectors. Then, Elias leaned in and whispered 3 words in Greek that made Amara's heart stop. "The vintage bottle." Julian nodded, his hand twitching toward his cuff. "1 sip, and the heart stops, just like we planned." Amara looked at the crystal decanter on the desk. She looked at the smirking guards. She realized that in less than 5 minutes, the most powerful man in the city would be a corpse, and the only person who understood why was the waitress they all ignored. Inside the office, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and impending death. Silas Kong checked his Patek Philippe. Precision was his religion. Every night at 8:25, he poured a glass of the 1945 Rothschild. It was his only ritual, his only indulgence. His security chief, Elias, stepped forward. "Everything is secure for the night, sir," he said in English, his voice a mask of perfect loyalty. Silas didn't look up from his ledger. "Then leave. I want the room." Elias's jaw tightened. "Of course, sir. Enjoy your drink." The guards exchanged a glance. The trap was set. Outside, life at the Gilded Lily operated on a different frequency. Amara stood in the kitchen prep area, her hands trembling so hard the silver tray rattled. She had $40 in tips in her pocket, enough for her bus pass and a cheap meal. She had a grandmother waiting at home who needed her to keep this job. If she walked into that room and she was wrong, she was fired. If she walked into that room and she was right, she was a target for 2 of the most dangerous hitmen in the underworld. She looked at the door to the executive suite. She remembered her mother's voice telling her that silence was a choice, but bravery was a duty. She saw the guards exit the room and stand post at the door, looking at their watches. They were waiting for the silence that follows a final breath. Amara gripped the tray. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the only person on Earth who could stop the clock. The heavy double doors of the kitchen swung shut, muffled by the thick velvet curtains that lined the restaurant's corridors, but the silence did little to quiet the ringing in Amara's ears. Every time she closed her eyes, she wasn't in a high-rise executive suite. She was back on the salt-sprayed Astoria docks, a skinny girl with tangled hair sitting on a stack of weathered shipping crates. Her father had been a longshoreman, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease and brine. He had worked alongside the old guard, men who had come over from Piraeus and Thessaloniki with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a fierce, insular loyalty to their own. They were men like Elias and Julian, though with far more honor and far less polish. They spoke Greek not just as a language, but as a fortress, a way to discuss business, grief, and survival without the outside world peering in. Amara's father had told her early on, "A girl who listens is a girl who survives." While the other kids played in the streets, Amara sat at the edge of the docks, pretending to read her school books while her ears tuned into the rhythmic, guttural flow of the dock workers' conversations. At first, it was just the names of fish and the curses of tired men. But slowly, the syntax took shape. She began to understand the nuances of their shorthand, the way a single word could shift from a joke to a threat based on the tilt of a chin. She had never told a soul she understood them. In the world she grew up in, a young black girl knowing the private business of the Greek mob wasn't an asset, it was a death sentence. To the dock workers, she was just the quiet kid, a part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the rusting cranes overhead. She learned to keep her face a mask of perfect, wide-eyed ignorance. She learned the power of being underestimated. That silence had followed her to the Gilded Lily. In the world of high finance and organized shadows, the help was expected to be a collection of sensory organs without a brain. She was paid to see if a glass was empty, to hear if a steak was undercooked, and to speak only in the polished, subservient tones of a professional. Her intelligence was a secret she guarded like a weapon in a hidden holster. She had watched Silas Kong for months, noting the way he navigated his world with a predator's grace, but she had also watched his guards. She had seen the way Elias's eyes lingered too long on the safe, and how Julian's hand shook ever so slightly when he thought no one was looking. She knew the weight of secrets. She knew that once you broke the seal on a hidden truth, you could never pour it back in. As she leaned against the cool tile of the prep station, the silver tray still clutched to her chest, she realized the docks had prepared her for this moment. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a translator of death, and the mask of the invisible girl was finally about to crack. The air inside Silas Kang's private office didn't just feel conditioned. It felt pressurized, as if the very molecules were held in place by the sheer force of his will. Large, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of a city that looked like a sprawling circuit board of neon and glass, but Silas rarely looked at the view. To him, the skyline wasn't scenery. It was an inventory of what he owned and what he intended to take. He sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian-stained oak, a surface so dark it seemed to swallow the light from the vintage brass lamp beside him. Silas was a man of sharp lines and sharper silences. His suit was a masterpiece of charcoal wool, tailored so precisely that it looked like armor. He didn't fidget, he didn't lean. He simply existed at the center of his empire, a predator who had long ago traded his claws for a fountain pen and a network of unbreakable contracts. He was the chairman, the man who moved the pieces on the board while everyone else was still trying to understand the rules of the game. The atmosphere of the room was one of absolute, terrifying control. There was no clutter here, only a crystal decanter of whiskey, a closed leather-bound ledger, and the faint, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a heartbeat in the stillness. It was a sanctuary of old money power, where decisions were made that could collapse industries or erase bloodlines over a single phone call. The door chided open with a soft, mechanical click, and Julian entered, moving with the practiced, silent gait of a man who knew exactly where the blind spots in the security cameras were. In his gloved hands, he carried a wooden crate lined with velvet. Inside sat the prize, a bottle of 1945 Rothschild, its label yellowed with age, its cork sealed with the dust of history. This was the ritual. Every Tuesday, after the markets closed and the city began its descent into the night, Silas partook in a glass of history. It was his only visible vice, a moment of quiet reflection that he guarded with his life. "The vintage has arrived, sir," Julian said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. He set the bottle on the side table, his movements economical and respectful. Beside him, Elias stood near the window, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the horizon with the vacant intensity of a loyal hound. Silas gave a curt nod, his eyes never leaving the documents in front of him. "Pour it!" As the dark, ruby-red liquid spiraled into the crystal glass, the scent of oak and dark fruit filled a small radius around the desk. It looked like liquid velvet, beautiful and deep. Under the dim, cinematic glow of the office, the wine caught the light, shimmering with an invitation that felt almost sacred. Silas finally set his pen down, the metal clacking softly against the stone desk. He reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from the stem of the glass. He was ready to taste the fruits of his labor, unaware that the vintage had been seasoned with something far more permanent than time. Amara stood paralyzed behind the ornate, silk-paneled partition that separated the service alcove from the main expanse of the chairman's office. She was supposed to be checking the inventory of the crystal glassware, but her breath hitched as the heavy thud of the office door echoed, signaling the room had been cleared of outsiders. Only Silas, Elias, and Julian remained. She should have made her presence known, should have cleared her throat or stepped out with her tray, but a primal instinct, the same one that had kept her safe on the Astoria docks, pressed her back into the shadows. The silence of the room was broken not by English, but by the low, gravelly vibration of Greek. It was a dialect thick with the slang of the Piraeus underworld, a language designed to be a shroud. "Is it done?" Julian asked, his voice, usually so clipped and professional in English, sounded oily and anxious in his native tongue. "The neurotoxin is in the bottle," Elias replied. Amara heard the faint, metallic clink of a glass stopper hitting the tray. 3 drops. By the time he realizes the wine tastes of bitter almonds, his vocal cords will already be paralyzed. He'll sit there, staring at us, unable to even gasp while his heart simply forgets how to beat. Amara's blood turned to ice. She gripped the edge of the mahogany shelving, her knuckles turning a ghostly white. Through the thin gap in the partition, she saw the silhouette of Elias, the man Silas trusted to take a bullet for him, leaning over the desk with the predatory posture of a vulture. "And the rival family?" Julian whispered, a nervous edge to his words. "The Varkas brothers?" "The bottle will be wiped," Elias said, his tone chillingly calm. "I've already planted the digital trail. The police will find a payment from the Varkas' accounts to the kitchen staff. Silas dies of a stroke. The rivals take the blame, and we walk out of here with the keys to the kingdom. He's lived a long life, Julian. It's time he shared the wealth." They laughed, a soft, dry sound that lacked any warmth. To them, the man sitting just feet away was already a ghost. They spoke with the casual indifference of mechanics discussing a broken engine, never imagining that the invisible black girl in the shadows understood every treacherous syllable. Amara looked down at her hands. They were shaking so violently she had to press them against her stomach to keep them from hitting the partition. She looked toward the exit, a few steps away. She could run. She could slip out the service door, disappear into the night, and let the poison do its work. Silas Kong had never looked her in the eye. He didn't even know her last name. Why should she risk her life for a man who didn't see her? But then she heard the sound of a chair creaking, the sound of Silas Kong reaching for the glass. The countdown had reached 0. The invisible girl was the only person in the world who could hear the scream that Silas wouldn't be able to make. The stillness in the office was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that made the simple act of breathing feel like a transgression. Silas Kong did not rush. He moved with the agonizing deliberation of a man who believed time itself was his subordinate. His hand, steady and tan against the white of his French cuffs, finally closed around the stem of the crystal glass. The movement was fluid, an elegant arc that brought the poison vintage closer to his face. Behind him, Elias and Julian had assumed their positions like stone monuments to devotion. To any observer, they were the pinnacle of professional security, chests out, hands clasped low, gazes fixed forward with an intensity that suggested they would gladly give their lives to protect the man in the chair. But from her vantage point behind the partition, Amara saw the truth in the minute details. She saw the way Elias's pulse throbbed at the base of his throat, a rhythmic tick of anticipation. She saw Julian's eyes, normally sharp and scanning, now locked onto the rim of that glass with a hungry, predatory focus. They weren't guarding a life anymore, they were officiating a funeral. Silas lifted the glass. He swirled the deep crimson liquid, watching the legs of the wine coat the crystal, the viscous residue of a high-quality vintage. He brought it to his nose, closing his eyes to inhale the bouquet of dark cherries, damp earth, and the faint, bitter hint of almonds that he likely mistook for the character of the wood. The dim light of the desk lamp caught the surface of the wine, reflecting a shimmering ruby red across his sharp, focused features. He looked satisfied, a man enjoying the one moment of his day where he wasn't required to be a weapon. "A good year," Silas murmured, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. Perhaps the last of its kind. The irony was a physical blow to Amara's chest. The guards remained silent, their faces masks of stone, though she imagined she could hear the frantic pounding of their hearts. The glass reached Silas's lips. The rim touched his skin. He tilted his head back slightly, the dark liquid shivering at the edge of the crystal, ready to spill past his teeth and begin the silent, chemical shutdown of his nervous system. Amara's world narrowed down to that single point of contact, the glass against the man's mouth. Her silver serving tray felt like a lead weight in her hand, her heart a trapped bird hammering against her ribs. She was a waitress, a ghost, a girl from the docks with nothing to her name. But as the first drop of the poisoned Rothschild moved to cross the threshold, she realized she couldn't let the silence win. The invisible girl was about to scream. The barrier between the service alcove and the executive suite was more than just silk and wood. It was the boundary of Amara's world. To cross it without an invitation was to invite ruin, but to stay behind it was to witness a murder. As the wine touched Silas's lips, the internal dam finally broke. Amara didn't just step out. She lunged, her silver tray clattering against the doorframe as she burst into the pressurized silence of the room. "Stop!" The word tore from her throat, raw and jagged, shattering the carefully curated atmosphere of the office. The reaction was instantaneous. Silas's hand froze, the glass hovering a fraction of an inch from his mouth. He didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed into cold, lethal slits as they fixed on the girl in the apron. However, the true violence came from the shadows behind him. Elias and Julian moved with the synchronized speed of vipers. Before Amara could even take a second breath, Elias was across the room. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. His hand clamped around her upper arm like a steel shackle, his fingers digging into the muscle with enough force to bruise. He twisted her toward the door, his face a mask of simulated outrage that barely hid the frantic panic underneath. "What do you think you're doing?" Elias hissed, his voice a low, dangerous snarl. "Get out before I have you thrown from the roof." "The wine!" Amara gasped, her lungs burning as she struggled against his grip. "Sir, you can't drink that." Silas set the glass down on the obsidian desk with a click that sounded like a gunshot. He leaned back, his expression one of bored, dark annoyance. "Elias, why is the help screaming in my office? I pay for discretion, not drama." "She's clearly unwell, sir," Julian added, stepping forward to block Amara's view of the desk. His hands were tucked behind his back, but Amara could see the tension in his shoulders. He was ready to snap her neck if Elias didn't drag her out fast enough. "I'll handle this personally. She won't be a problem again." Julian reached for her other arm, but Amara planted her feet, leaning forward toward the desk with a desperation that defied her fear. She looked past the wall of dark suits, locking eyes with Silas. He looked at her not as a human being, but as a malfunctioning piece of equipment. "Don't drink it!" she screamed again, her voice cracking. "They're lying to you." "The bottle!" Elias's hand moved to her throat, cutting off her air, his eyes promising a quiet end in a dark hallway. The physical hostility was overwhelming. She was a girl in a restaurant apron being crushed between two trained killers while the man she was trying to save watched with a terrifying, detached curiosity. She was losing. The guards were winning. The silence of the office was closing back in, ready to swallow her whole before the poison could finish the job. The pressure in the room was suffocating. Elias's hand was a vice around Amara's throat, his thumb pressing dangerously against her windpipe to stifle any further outbursts. The guards were no longer just security, they were a closing trap. But Silas Kong did not look away. He sat in his leather throne, watching the struggle with an unnerving, icy detachment. He didn't look like a man in danger. He looked like a god deciding which insect to crush first. "Release her," Silas said. The command was quiet, but it carried the weight of an executioner's blade. Elias hesitated for a heartbeat, his eyes darting to Julian, before slowly pulling his hand back. Amara collapsed forward, gasping for air, her hands clutching the edge of the obsidian desk for support. Her hair was disheveled, her apron stained with sweat, but her eyes never left the glass of wine that sat innocently on the desk, shimmering like a liquid ruby under the lamp. Silas reached out, his fingers slowly brushing the crystal stem once more. He began to lift it, his gaze boring into Amara's soul. "You have exactly 10 seconds to justify this interruption, little girl," he murmured, his voice dripping with a lethal elegance. 10 seconds before I let Elias finish what he started. Why shouldn't I drink this wine? It is a 1945 Rothschild. It is perfection. Why are you screaming in my office? "It's not perfection," Amara choked out, her voice a ragged whisper. "It's a grave." Behind Silas, Julian moved, his hand reaching for the inside of his jacket where his sidearm was concealed. "She's delusional, sir. Likely high on something from the streets. Let us take her out and clean this up." Silas ignored him, his eyes locked on Amara. The glass was inches from his lips now, the scent of the neurotoxin, masked by the heavy bouquet of the vintage, wafting toward him. "A grave? That is a poetic accusation. But I don't pay for poetry. I pay for facts." Amara saw the guards tensing, preparing to lunge the second Silas took that sip. She saw the smirk of triumph hidden in the corner of Elias's mouth. She realized that English wouldn't save him. Logic wouldn't save him. She had to strip away the masks. She had to speak the language of the betrayal that had been whispered in the dark. 3 drops, she said, her voice suddenly steadying, the fear replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Silas paused, the rim of the glass touching his lower lip. Amara leaned in, her face inches from the man who could have her killed with a nod. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. She looked like a prophet of doom. 3 drops of neurotoxin. By the time you realize it tastes of bitter almonds, your vocal cords will be paralyzed. You'll sit there, staring at them, unable to gasp while your heart simply forgets how to beat. The silence that followed was deafening. The exact words Elias had used in the shadows. Silas froze, his eyes shifting from Amara to the men standing behind him. The air in the office didn't just feel pressurized anymore, it felt like it was about to explode. The stillness in the office became something physical, a cold vacuum where the only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing of the men behind the desk. Silas Kong didn't move. He held a glass of wine perfectly level, his gaze fixed on Amara with a terrifying, surgical focus. He was a man who lived in a world of subtext and shadows, and he had just heard his own death described with the clinical precision of a postmortem. "Where did you hear those words?" Silas asked. His voice was no longer a baritone, it was a razor-edge whisper. Amara didn't look at the guards. She knew that if she saw the murder in their eyes, her courage would fail. She kept her eyes locked on Silas, her voice rising in a steady, rhythmic cadence as she shifted into the guttural, rolling vowels of the Piraeus docks. "To vintage Bacali," she began, the Greek words cutting through the air like a serrated blade. "Try stagwans. Mekri na katalavii odi ekii jefsi pikru amygdala, oiphonetikes 2 chords the ekaun edi paralysiai." The effect was visceral. Behind Silas, the sound of a sharp, hitching intake of breath shattered the professional facade of the security team. Amara didn't stop. She repeated the rest of the betrayal word for word, her Greek fluent and biting, stripping away the guard's only remaining shield. She told him about the plan to frame the Varkas family, the planted digital trail, and the silent heart failure they had laughed about in the dark. Silas slowly lowered the glass. He didn't set it on the desk this time. He held it over the obsidian surface, his fingers tightening until the crystal groaned. He turned his head with agonizing slowness to look at Elias. The security chief's face had gone from stone to ash. The look of horror was absolute, a raw, naked terror that only comes when a man realizes the invisible variable has just destroyed his life's work. His mouth hung open, his tongue searching for a lie that wouldn't come, while Julian's hand, still hovering near his jacket, began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The secret language they had used as a fortress had become their cage. "You thought she was furniture," Silas said, his voice deceptively soft. "You thought because of the color of her skin and the apron she wears, she was deaf to the world you operate in." He turned back to Amara, and for the first time in the months she had worked at the Gilded Lily, he truly saw her. He didn't see a waitress or a servant. He saw the person who held the power of life and death in her hands. "Elias," Silas murmured, his eyes returning to the trembling guard. "Drink the wine." The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of a secret. It was the silence of a sentence being carried out. Elias looked at the glass, then at the man he had served for a decade, and finally at the girl from the docks who had unmade him with a few whispered words. The translation was complete. The treason was bare. The silence that followed Silas's command was broken only by the frantic, scraping sound of Julian attempting to draw his weapon. He never cleared leather. In a blur of motion, Silas, who had sat like a statue for the entire ordeal, lunged across the desk with the speed of a coiled viper. He didn't use a gun. He used the heavy crystal decanter, swinging it with a brutal, practiced efficiency that sent Julian crashing into the tall windows. Before Elias could react, Silas had a slim, silver-plated pistol aimed squarely at the security chief's forehead. "The test, Elias," Silas whispered, his breathing as calm as a winter morning. "Drink, or I'll find out the hard way if your skull is as thick as your greed." Elias stared at the glass on the desk, his face a mask of sweating, gray terror. He didn't reach for it. That was all the confirmation Silas needed. He signaled to a secondary, silent security team, the men who watched the Watchers, who swarmed the room from the outer corridor. They moved with the cold precision of machines, disarming the traitors and dragging them into the hallway where the shadows were deepest. The Gilded Lily had no room for failure, and Silas Kong had no room for mercy. When the doors clicked shut, leaving only Silas and Amara in the pressurized stillness of the office, the chairman finally set his weapon down. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, professional chemical testing kit, a tool of the trade for a man who lived in a world of poisoned gifts. He squeezed a single drop of reagent into the glass of Rothschild. Within seconds, the deep ruby liquid curdled into an oily, sickly violet. Silas stared at the glass for a long time. Then, he looked up at Amara. She was still standing by the desk, her silver tray clutched against her chest like a shield, her heart finally beginning to slow. She expected a dismissal, a non-disclosure agreement, or a cold "thank you," accompanied by a check to keep her quiet. Instead, Silas stood up and walked around the obsidian desk. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her, closing the distance between the chairman and the help. "I have spent my life making people invisible," Silas said, his voice stripped of its usual iron. "I thought it was a sign of power. I was wrong. It was a blind spot." He reached out, not to strike or to push, but to gently take the silver tray from her trembling hands. He set it on the desk, a relic of a life she would never return to. "Elias and Julian were my shadows for a decade. They spoke their treachery in a language they thought was a wall. You were the only one who had the bricks to climb it." He looked at her then, not through her. He saw the girl from the docks, the woman who spoke the language of secrets, and the only person in his empire he could actually trust. "The restaurant is no place for a woman with your ears, Amara Sterling. I need someone who can hear the things I cannot. I need a new shadow, one who actually knows the value of a life." Amara looked at the city skyline, the neon lights reflecting in the obsidian desk. The apron felt heavy, a skin she was ready to shed. She realized the alliance being offered wasn't just about survival, it was about becoming the most powerful ghost in the city. "I'm ready," she said, her voice finally steady. Silas nodded, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. "Good. Let's get to work."